The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song across Seattle General's third-floor ICU, a sound like insects trapped in glass. Megan O'Brien moved between rooms with the deliberate invisibility of someone who had learned to occupy space without demanding it, her white dansko silent on the linoleum, her movements economical, her eyes fixed on the monitors and vital sign charts that had become her language. Room 347. Room 349. Room 351. Each patient a set of numbers waiting to be documented, waiting to stabilize or decline, waiting for the next shift to inherit their crisis. She carried the medication cart like a shield. Behind it, no one asked questions. Behind it, no one expected her to make eye contact or participate in the small talk that bloomed around the nurse's station like mold. Her fingertips, calloused in ways that didn't match pushing buttons on 4 pumps, moved with impossible precision as she documented post-op vitals for Colonel James Hartwick in room 347, blood pressure stable at 118/76, oxygen saturation 98% on room air, heart rate a steady 72 beats per minute. The numbers sang. Everything about the Colonel's recovery trajectory was textbook perfect, which meant he was healing faster than men typically did, which meant his body had been through worse, which meant he understood what it meant to survive. She didn't linger. Not visibly. 30 seconds at his bedside, the same amount of time she spent at every other post-op patient's door, the same carefully measured interval that didn't draw attention. But her eyes moved across the monitors with the precision of someone reading a tactical map, not just the numbers, but the patterns beneath them, the small variations that suggested pain management was holding, that his lungs were clearing, that whatever had brought him to Helmand Province's most brutal terrain and back again had left him with the kind of nervous system that didn't dramatize its injuries. She checked his visitor log without seeming to. No one had signed in. The medication schedule showed post-op pain management every 4 hours, which meant he was either refusing additional doses or tolerating pain at a level that would make most men beg for morphine. The chart made a soft whisper as she closed it and moved on. Dr. Harrison Mercer arrived on morning rounds at 7:27 a.m., she knew because the coffee in the break room had just finished brewing, and she heard the elevator doors open with their pneumatic hiss from where she stood near the supply closet, checking for site dressings and mentally inventorying what she'd need for the post-op patients who would spike fevers by afternoon. Mercer's entrance was announcement enough. The nurse's station went quiet in the way it did when a predator walked into a room. Not frightened quiet. Careful quiet. The kind of silence that came from years of learning which staff members got asked their opinions and which ones got asked to fetch coffee. She didn't look up from the dressing change she was performing on a patient in room 350. Mercer's voice carried down the hallway with the particular timbre of a man who had never had to raise it to be heard. It was pitched low and steady, confident in its ability to fill whatever space it occupied. Morning rounds, people. Let's keep the standards high today. I've been reviewing the incident reports from this unit, and apparently someone thought it was acceptable to delay a medication administration by 6 minutes yesterday without notifying the attending. He paused. She could hear the pause, the way he was scanning faces, looking for flinching. We're a teaching hospital. That means protocols exist for a reason. The patient in room 350, a post-op hysterectomy case named Patricia Chen, tensed under Megan's hands. She felt it in the way Mrs. Chen's shoulders drew up toward her neck. Megan continued the dressing change with the same steady pressure, the same careful precision, and whispered, "Breathing helps with pain," which made Mrs. Chen exhale and soften just slightly. It was a small thing, a half sentence, barely worth calling reassurance. It was also the kind of thing that meant you couldn't hear Mercer's voice looking for victims, because someone was inside your head showing you how to breathe through fear. Mercer's entourage moved past, 2 junior residents in their short white coats that made them look like expensive ghosts, a med student taking notes with the desperate energy of someone still believing that observation alone could teach you how to save lives. Behind them, the ICU opened up like a held breath, waiting for whatever performance was about to occur. The colonel arrived during shift change, which meant the ward had that fractured quality where nothing was quite organized and everything required negotiation. Megan heard the commotion first. A patient transfer always came with noise, with the efficient bustle of people moving stretchers and checking monitors and verifying patient identification against hospital bracelets. But the Colonel's arrival had a different texture. The paramedics moved with the particular respect they reserved for military personnel, the kind of careful handling that suggested someone had called ahead, had explained who he was, had made sure the right team knew a green beret was coming through the door. She saw him from the supply room doorway as they wheeled him past. Scarred hands. That was the first thing. The kind of scars that didn't come from kitchen accidents or childhood falls. The kind of scars that had healed badly because there hadn't been time to heal well, because the priority had been staying alive instead of staying pretty. His forearms showed the cross-hatched pattern of field medicine and field living, white lines against tanned skin, systematic marks that told a story of someone who had learned how his body could be broken and still function. His face had the particular weatheredness of a man who'd spent his 40s doing the kind of work that most men never recovered from. Maybe 53, maybe 58. Age didn't matter much when you'd lived in Helmand Province long enough to understand what temperature and dust and constant alertness did to skin. He was conscious but sedated, his eyes moving slowly across the ceiling as they transferred him from the stretcher to the bed. His hand, the left one, reached out instinctively for something to hold, and the ICU nurse, Rodriguez, competent, kind, someone who hadn't learned yet that kindness could get you targeted by doctors like Mercer, reached down and let him grip her gloved fingers. That's when his eyes fixed on something. Not on Rodriguez. On Megan, who was standing in the supply room doorway, her hands full of sterile dressing packages, her face arranged in the carefully blank expression that came from years of not drawing attention. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. His pupils recognized something in hers. Something that lived in the same territory his pupils came from. Something that didn't belong in Seattle General's gleaming ICU at all, something out of place like a knife in a surgical suite or blood on a wedding dress. His hand tightened on Rodriguez's fingers, and then the sedation took over, and his eyes rolled slightly back, and whatever recognition had flickered across his face disappeared like a light switching off in an abandoned building. Megan turned and restocked the supply cart with the same measured efficiency she'd used 10,000 times before. The moment didn't require processing. The moment was something filed and stored, something that existed in a part of her memory that didn't interfere with her current job, her current identity, her current desperate necessity to blend into the beige and fluorescent landscape of Seattle General for the next 27 days until the assignment was complete and she could disappear again. Dr. Mercer appeared at the nurse's station around 8:15 a.m., his pen tapping against a printed supply requisition form from Meridian Pharma, a pharmaceutical supplier that Megan had learned to recognize from the logos that appeared on half the equipment in the ICU. She was entering vital signs into the electronic medical record from room 352 when she heard his voice, directed at no one in particular but clearly meant for everyone. "Standards are what separate professional institutions from mediocrity," he said, his tone conversational but his audience captive. "I notice we're still ordering orthopedic supplies at rates that suggest someone doesn't understand cost-benefit analysis. The administration trusts me to maintain fiscal responsibility on this unit. That trust is not negotiable." The junior residents nodded. The med student scribbled notes. No one mentioned that Seattle General's orthopedic wing was currently handling a massive influx of reconstructive cases from a ferry collision 2 weeks prior, which meant the supply orders reflected actual patient needs instead of inflated requisitions. No one mentioned that because saying so would mean contradicting Dr. Mercer, and contradicting Dr. Mercer meant finding yourself on the wrong end of his annual evaluation. Megan continued entering data. Respiratory rate. Temperature. Urine output. The numbers flowed from her observations into the system like blood through veins, the kind of constant, invisible work that kept patients alive and doctors free to worry about their own advancement. But she noticed the supply cart. The orthopedic cart, the one kept restocked in the hallway near the surgical prep area. The quantities were unusual. Not subtly unusual, the kind of unusual that a nurse who'd worked 3 combat medic deployments in field hospitals with chronic supply shortages recognized immediately. Too many for 0.8mm cancellous screws. Too many titanium plate assortments. Too many bandaging systems that cost 3 times what equivalent materials cost from other suppliers. The cart was overstocked in the way that only happened when someone was ordering beyond immediate need, ordering in quantities that suggested the real surplus was being shipped somewhere else or someone was being paid to order more than was necessary. She filed the observation away in the same mental compartment as the Colonel's recognition. Things to see. Things to understand. Things that didn't factor into her current mission, which was staying invisible, staying unremarkable, staying present in the room with Colonel James Hartwick for the next 4 weeks to make sure no one hurt him while he healed. The morning rounds continued. Dr. Mercer stopped at each patient room with his entourage, and at each stop, he said something designed to establish hierarchy, to remind everyone which direction the authority flowed. At room 343, he corrected a resident's assessment of a post-op infection risk with a tone that made the resident's face go pale. At room 345, he asked a med student a question he clearly knew she couldn't answer, then smiled when she stammered, the smile like a wolf showing its teeth. At room 349, he barely glanced at the patient, a 76-year-old man recovering from hernia repair, nodding at the numbers and moving on without once looking at the man's face. When Mercer's group reached room 347, Megan was already past them, already restocking supplies in the central station, already invisible in the way she'd perfected over 23 years of making herself a background detail in other people's hierarchies. The Colonel was still sedated, still beautiful in the way that battle-scarred men sometimes were, all the wasted motion burned away, leaving nothing but functionality. Mercer glanced at his chart without reading it, nodded at his vitals without processing them, and moved on. His attention had already migrated to the next room, the next performance, the next opportunity to remind everyone of exactly who owned the third floor of Seattle General. But as Mercer's entourage passed, the Colonel's eyes opened just enough to watch them go. Not focused. Not aware. Just tracking movement the way a predator tracks prey even in its sleep. And when they were gone, when the moment had passed, his eyes found hers again across the open space of the ICU, across the careful distance she maintained, across all the careful distance she'd built between who she'd been and who she'd become. This time, she didn't look away. The morning rounds began like every other morning at Seattle General, fluorescent glare, the smell of antiseptic layered over something metallic underneath, the soft beep of monitors keeping their rhythm. Megan pushed the medication cart down the hallway, her fingers moving through the familiar motions, for bags organized by patient room, syringes arranged in ascending order of gauge, documentation trailing behind like a shadow she couldn't quite catch up to. She'd been 6 minutes behind. That was the entire offense. Room 319 had needed her more than the paperwork did. A post-op bleed, the kind that whispered before it screamed. Mr. Chen, 73, 12 hours out of spinal fusion, his drain output suddenly dark and viscous instead of the pale pink it should have been. She'd called the attending, yes, the one Dr. Mercer didn't approve of her calling directly, and she'd held manual compression on the incision site while the surgical resident couldn't find the bleeder on ultrasound. Her hand slick. The clock moving. 60 seconds became 90. 90 became 180. By the time the attending arrived and took over, the bleeding had slowed. By the time she'd washed the blood from her forearms and documented the intervention, she was 6 minutes late charting her morning medications for the Johnson family's son, Marcus, who'd had spinal stabilization yesterday and was sleeping peacefully in room for 12 like nothing had happened. Dr. Mercer found her at the medication cart. "Nurse O'Brien." His voice carried the particular timbre of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Perhaps you're confused about our documentation protocols." She didn't look up from the cart. Her jaw tightened once, then released. Composure was a muscle. It had to be exercised constantly. Or perhaps you simply don't care about patient safety. He was louder now, deliberately so. The hallway was listening. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson stood in their son's doorway, watching. "At Seattle General we maintain standards, nurse. 6-minute delays in charting are unacceptable. If you can't manage the workload, we can find someone who can." The medication chart in her hand trembled for exactly 1 heartbeat, then stilled. She set it down with the precision of someone placing a bomb, counted to 5, and looked up. Her eyes met his, a stare so flat and cold it could have frost-burned glass. The patient in 319 is alive because I was 6 minutes late with paperwork. She turned and walked away, her footsteps perfectly measured on the tile floor, each one a drumbeat. Behind her, she could hear Mercer's breathing, the shallow, quick breathing of a man whose face had just gone mottled purple. The break room that afternoon smelled like stale coffee and the particular loneliness of institutional fluorescent lighting. Megan sat down at the small table with her lunch, the container she'd brought from home that morning, chicken and brown rice, nothing fancy. 3 nurses stood at the counter. They saw her. Their eyes registered her presence. And then, in a movement so synchronized it could only have been discussed beforehand, they gathered their trays and left. No words. That was the worst part. Words would have been something to push against. Words would have created friction, friction creates heat, heat creates movement. But silence was a wall made of nothing, which meant it was unbreakable. She ate alone. The sandwich was dry. Or maybe her mouth was just that closed. By shift change, the write-up was pinned to the unit board where everyone would see it, positioned at eye level like a trophy or a warning. The nursing supervisor who'd typed it wouldn't meet her eyes, wouldn't acknowledge the injustice written in black ink on white paper. Nurse M. The Brian, failure to follow chain of command, called attending physician directly during code blue incident instead of paging through proper supervisory channels per protocol section 4.2.1. It was technically true. During the code, she had called Dr. Saunders directly instead of paging Mercer first, because Mercer was 40 seconds away in his office and the patient had 12 seconds of perfusion left. But technically true and actually just were different countries. That night, as she was restocking the supply closet at the end of shift, Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway with a kind of timing that suggested he'd been waiting. His voice was smooth now, which was somehow worse than the morning's theatrical rage. Smooth was the voice of someone confident in their power. Seattle General has standards, Nurse O'Brien. Rigid standards. Patient safety depends on chain of command, on protocol, on respect for hierarchy. He stepped closer. The closet suddenly felt very small. I think perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a clinic. Somewhere less demanding. Somewhere that doesn't require the same level of professionalism we maintain here. The implication was clear: leave, or he would make your life unmanageable until you did. She let him finish. She waited 3 seconds after he closed his mouth. And then she spoke, her voice quiet enough that he had to lean in slightly to hear it clearly. The only standard being violated here is the one where Meridian Pharma pays you 40 cents on every dollar of ortho supplies you order at 3 times the regional market rate, doctor. His face went white. Not red. White. The color of blood suddenly rushing to somewhere else, his spine, his stomach, his hands, which began to shake very slightly. She walked away without waiting for a response. Her heartbeat didn't elevate. Her hands didn't tremble. The muscle memory of compartmentalization was strong in her. She could lock fear into a box, put the box on a shelf, and come back to it later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes never. 2 days passed. She worked her shifts, moved through the hospital with the kind of invisible presence that came from years of training to be seen but not noticed. The colonel was recovering well, his vital signs stable, his surgical sites healing with the clean trajectory of someone whose body responded to trauma the way a soldier's body was built to respond. She'd noticed him watching her on the 3rd day post-op, his eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that suggested recognition, or at least the ghost of it. In the ER that morning, the paramedics wheeled in a green beret staff sergeant with shrapnel embedded in his thigh, a training accident from a range 40 minutes north, the kind of injury that looked dramatic but was actually manageable if you caught it in time. The attending called for an emergency chest drain setup despite the injury being nowhere near the chest, an abundance of caution that made sense given the patient's age and the depth of the laceration. Megan moved to the trauma bay and began prepping the kit without being asked. Her hands knew this choreography. The betadine tray positioned at 45 degrees. The trocar prepared, the drainage tube pre-measured to the 4th rib space with the kind of precision that didn't come from textbooks. The sergeant watched her through the haze of field anesthesia, his pupils dilated, his eyes suddenly sharp. "That's a bagram cut," he said. His voice was rough, the accent of the South Carolina low country underneath the military bearing. The angle. The rib spacing. That's exactly how they teach it in the 160th Forward Surgical Unit. "Where do you serve?" Megan didn't look up. She adjusted the betadine tray with 3 fingers. "I didn't." But her hands betrayed her. The unconscious reach for the patient's far shoulder before leaning over the incision. The briefest glance toward the trauma bay entrance, checking for incoming fire, a habit so ingrained it had probably been there for 15 years. The way her shoulders moved through the procedure like someone who'd done it 1,000 times in conditions considerably worse than a sterile operating room. The sergeant stared at her for 5 more seconds, his chemically clouded mind nonetheless recognizing something his body understood. Then he let it drop. But she could feel his questions accumulating, stacking up like the evidence of a life she'd supposedly never lived. She checked on Colonel Hartwick immediately after, moving through the ICU with her usual unhurried efficiency. His chart had been moved to a separate pile on Dr. Mercer's desk, unusual for a routine recovery case, the kind of detail that made the back of her neck prickle with attention. His visitor log, tucked into the plastic sleeve on his bedside table, showed 3 names she didn't recognize, all claiming to be family friends from his overseas deployments, all visiting during Dr. Mercer's shift. She photographed the log with her phone camera, angling it carefully to catch the printed names and their signatures. The hospital's security system would have records, but this was faster. She texted the image to an encrypted number she'd memorized 6 months ago, the kind of number that wasn't in any phone and couldn't be traced backward. The response came 3 minutes later, a single word. "Continue." That night, alone in her apartment in Savannah's historic district, she sat at her laptop with her coffee gone cold beside her and ran the supply requisitions through a pattern-matching algorithm. The screen populated with red flags like a Christmas tree designed by an accountant. Every orthopedic surgery in the past 8 months showed supply costs 38 to 42% above regional average. Every single one. All from Meridian Pharma. All approved personally by Dr. Mercer. The cumulative overage totaled somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,200,000, give or take the rounding error on implants. She saved the spreadsheet to an encrypted drive. But that wasn't her mission. That was just leverage. The Colonel was the actual mission. The fraud was just a weapon to use if she had to. But that wasn't the worst part, that wasn't what kept her awake, staring at her apartment ceiling, at the shadows cast by streetlights through Venetian blinds, at the shape of a life that had already been destroyed once and could apparently be destroyed again if she wasn't careful. 2 days after the supply closet, Megan sat in the staff break room watching her coffee cool into a skin of brown film nobody wanted to disturb. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a sickly wash, the walls, the chipped mugs, the faces of people who'd stopped pretending she existed. Her shoulder ached where the fall from the stretcher 6 months ago had left a constellation of scar tissue beneath her scrub top. Not from that fall. From Kandahar. But nobody asked questions anymore. Nobody asked Megan anything. The assignment board changed at 0800. Mercer had added her name to 3 concurrent documentation audits, charts from March, April, and May, requiring 16 additional hours of retrospective review. The same charts he'd approved without comment in real time. Strategic. Precise. The moves of someone who understood that the most effective punishment wasn't her accusation. It was paperwork. It was visibility. It was making sure she never had the time to notice what he was doing, much less prove it. She was still staring at the cold coffee when the ER bay doors burst open and a paramedic crew wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man whose right thigh was wrapped in battle dressing, blood already seeping through the white gauze in a spreading crimson flower. The man's jaw was set in the particular way of someone who'd learned not to scream, and when he locked eyes with the triage nurse, he said 4 words, "Get a Brian if available." The ER charge nurse hesitated. That should have been the first clue that something was wrong with the request itself. Megan was already moving toward the bay when the paramedic called out, "Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, training accident, foot Lewis range, shrapnel embedded in vastus medialis and adductor magnus, vital stable, alert and oriented ×3. Incoming for emergency chest drain. No. Not chest drain. Webb's vitals were steady. His breathing was clear. The chest drain was a prep for something else entirely. A test. She understood immediately. A Green Beret didn't get shrapnel from a training accident and stay calm in a triage bay. A Green Beret didn't remember the name of an ER nurse he'd never met unless someone told him to look for her. Unless someone told him exactly what to watch for. She was moving before conscious thought. The bay's stainless steel surface caught the overhead lights like a blade. Webb's eyes tracked her as she approached, taking in her movements, the way she'd already begun pulling on nitrile gloves with her left hand while her right hand prepared the betadine tray, muscle memory that moved her body without requiring permission from her brain. The cotton-sweet smell of antiseptic hung in the air, cut through with something copper-dark underneath, old blood, fierce sweat, the specific scent of someone bleeding out slowly on someone else's clock. Chest drain prep, Webb said, his voice carrying the gravel of someone who'd been smoking unfiltered cigarettes in desert compounds for too many years. Show me technique. He wasn't asking. Commands dressed as polite statements never asked. She moved her hands into position, index and middle finger finding the space between ribs 4 and 5, lateral to the sternal border, her touch light as a surgeon's prayer. The skin was pale where she touched it, the underlying structure solid beneath her fingertips. She'd done this 17 times in real conditions. Twice in full firefights. Once with her own blood dripping on the patient's chest because the bullet that caught her arm hadn't been kind about angles. Incision here, she said, marking the spot with her clean hand. Blunt dissection through the pleural space. 36 French chest tube. One-way flutter valve. You're not fighting gravity with a hemothorax, you're fighting physics. Webb watched her hands move. Watched the way she positioned herself, the way her body angled to give her full range of motion while keeping one eye on the ventilator readout and another on the door. Watched the way she didn't flinch when his leg spasmed from pain or shock or the specific knowledge of what shrapnel does to muscle tissue when it travels at supersonic velocity. That's a Bagram cut, Webb said quietly, his eyes never leaving her hands. That technique. The angle. Saw it once in the AABB med tent when a girl with captain's bars spent 4 hours on a blown-up Ranger with a sucking chest wound and a prayer. Where do you serve? Megan adjusted the betadine tray. Didn't answer. Didn't have to. Some questions came with their own silence built in, and Staff Sergeant Webb had just asked the only question that mattered. Her jaw clenched once, hard enough that her molars ached, and then the moment passed like a convoy at night, there and then gone and then impossible to catch up to. He sent you, she said. Not a question. Colonel Hartwig's coming in for post-op follow-up. Webb's voice dropped lower, meant for her alone. 7 days post-op from his initial shrapnel removal. Scheduled discharge Friday. But something's not right with the paperwork. Mercer's been altering the discharge notes, and there's a notation for psychiatric hold pending evaluation, which means they're trying to keep him contained, Megan finished. Make him unstable on paper so they can justify extended hold when he tries to leave. Webb nodded once. A soldier's nod. An acknowledgement that they both understood the game and the stakes and the specific brutality of using a hospital system as a cage. Megan turned away before anyone could read her face. Check the clock, 14:33. Her shift was supposed to end at 3 p.m. 7 minutes before the change of staff when the ICU would be least supervised, when the documentation burden would land squarely on whoever worked night shift, when Mercer typically retreated to his office to review charts with the door closed. She filed the information into the architecture of her memory where she kept other useful facts, blind spots, patrol patterns, windows of vulnerability that existed only if you were patient enough to count the seconds. By the time she finished the pre-op documentation, Mercer had already updated the assignment board. Megan was now restricted to chart review duties for the entire week. She would not be assigned to any ICU bay. She would not be permitted to perform direct patient care. And most importantly, she would not have access to Colonel Hartwick's room when he arrived for his post-op follow-up. The restriction was dressed in official language, stamped with hospital protocol. Nursing staff shall prioritize specialty documentation compliance following missed charting incidents. Assignment restricted to clerical duties per physician directive, effective immediately. She read it once. Didn't read it twice. Didn't need to. The message was written in Dr. Mercer's perfect script, signed and initialed with the kind of precision that came from someone who'd learned to weaponize bureaucracy long before he learned medicine. That night, at 22:33, Megan sat in her apartment in Savannah's historic district, in a one-bedroom above a closed antique shop on Bull Street, and pulled out the faded 7th Special Forces group patch from inside her jacket lining. The embroidery was coming loose at one corner. The color had faded from deep green to something closer to sage, something that looked like it had been through 3 desert tours and a firefight where someone had bled on it trying to save a life that probably didn't survive anyway. She held it in her palm without moving. Without speaking. Without allowing herself the luxury of the thoughts that came when you had too much time and not enough noise to fill it with. The rain outside was starting to pick up, hammering the fire escape in a rhythm that sounded almost like helicopter rotors if you wanted it to sound like that. If you let yourself want things. The colonel would arrive tomorrow morning. They would try to keep her away from him. And she would have to make a decision about whether the mission was worth the price of staying invisible any longer, or whether some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed no matter how much betadine you used to wash them clean. She folded the patch carefully, tucked it back into the lining, sat in the dark while the rain continued its percussion against the window, patient and relentless, the kind of weather that didn't negotiate or ask permission. Tomorrow would bring fire. She could feel it coming the way soldiers feel weather changes, in the bones, in the scars, in the specific awareness of someone whose body had already learned to flinch before the shaking started. But tonight, there was only rain and silence and the weight of a secret that was already beginning to tear itself open at the seams, like shrapnel working its way through tissue, inevitably, toward the surface where the light could finally see it. Tuesday at 2:08 p.m., Colonel Hartwick's eyes stopped focusing on the present moment. The monitors had been steady all morning, blood pressure holding at 118/76, heart rate steady at 62, oxygen saturation riding the comfortable side of 96%. He'd eaten a real lunch for the first time since arrival, turkey sandwich with mustard, and then something shifted behind his pupils like a door closing in a room Megan couldn't see. His hand started trembling. Not the trembling of pain or infection, but the trembling of someone whose nervous system had suddenly decided that Helmand Province was occupying the same space as this hospital room. His breath came shallow. His eyes darted to the corners of the ceiling where there were no threats and back again, tracking invisible movement with the hyperfocus of a man whose brain had learned that inattention meant death. Megan was at the nursing station reviewing post-op labs when the alarm sounded, not the urgent code blue beep but the steady, insistent call of a patient's agitation threshold being crossed. She was moving before the call light registered on the board, her feet already carrying her to wardroom 412. She'd seen this before. Not in this hospital, not in this country, but in field tents and compound rooms and the back of Black Hawks where soldiers were trying to reconcile two different realities occupying the same skull. PTSD episodes weren't emergencies until they were. And then they became everything. She pushed into the room with her hands visible and her voice pitched low and steady. "Colonel. You're at Seattle General. You're safe." The words didn't land. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle working under his skin like machinery trying to break itself. He was reaching for something under his pillow, his movements becoming frantic, desperate. His military training was still there underneath the panic, the compartmentalization that had kept him alive through 7 deployments cracking like old paint. And then his hand emerged with a smoke grenade. The metal sphere was military grade, the pin still threaded through the firing mechanism, the kind that shouldn't exist anywhere in the continental United States, let alone in a hospital room. His fingers found the pin. His eyes were somewhere else entirely, San Jin Valley, 2012, the moment before everything went wrong. Megan didn't think. Her body moved on protocols written into muscle memory by years of training that had nothing to do with nursing school. She crossed the room in 3 steps, her right shoulder dropping low as she launched herself across his torso, her left arm sweeping for the grenade even as his fingers pulled the safety pin free. The explosion happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The sound was nothing like she expected, not the sharp crack of ordnance but a dull, violent pop followed by the hiss of burning chemicals. The smoke came second, acrid and white, filling the room with the smell of magnesium burning. But the shrapnel came first. A fragment the size of a thumbnail caught her in the left shoulder, punching through skin and muscle with the casual finality of a bullet fired at close range. Another piece caught her ribs on the left side, lower, sliding between 2 ribs with a sensation like ice water being injected directly into her lungs. Blood filled the left side of her scrubs. She could feel it, warm and spreading, the way you feel weather changes after you've been in enough combat zones. You know it's there before your conscious mind catches up to the data. She did not scream. She did not move away from the colonel. She stayed exactly where she was, her body still covering his, her right hand finding his carotid artery and pressing down hard enough to maintain blood flow. The pain was information. The blood was quantifiable. The damage could be addressed after she kept him breathing. "You're with me," she said, her voice coming out steady, almost conversational, as if she wasn't bleeding into a hospital bed. She shifted her weight slightly, feeling the grenade's fragment settle in her tissue like someone had driven broken glass through her side. "You're with me, Colonel." Not Sanjin. Seattle. September 2024. She switched to Pashto without thinking about it, the language arriving in her mouth like she'd spoken it yesterday instead of 4 years ago in another country where green seemed like a color that shouldn't exist. Zia Yum Saumdar. Awa Aman Day. Awa Dr. Day. I am with you. You are safe. You have a doctor. The colonel's breathing began to slow. His eyes started tracking actual objects in the room instead of ghosts. The secondary adrenaline response that comes when someone realizes they're being held, that they're not alone, that the person holding them isn't an enemy combatant but a human being speaking words in a language that meant home. The smoke was clearing. Hospital staff was flooding through the doorway now, their hands covering their mouths, someone grabbing for the grenade fragment still scattered on the linoleum floor. Alarms had activated on every monitor. Code overhead announced overhead in that automated female voice that made everything sound distant and procedural. But Megan's focus remained exactly where it needed to be, on the colonel's carotid, on his breathing, on keeping him conscious as his body registered the trauma that had just occurred. Blood loss at this rate was approximately 4 minutes before cardiac arrest became inevitable. She didn't have 4 minutes. She had what was in front of her right now. She was starting to feel the edge of shock creeping through her own nervous system, cold at the periphery of her vision, but shock was a luxury. She needed to stop the bleeding on the colonel and then on herself, in that order. Her left arm wasn't functional anymore, the shrapnel had hit with precision, severing something that made her shoulder want to fall off her body. She shifted weight, using her right arm to keep the colonel grounded while she reached for the tourniquet kit on the wall-mounted trauma station behind the bed. Her fingers found the elastic, found the metal buckle. She looked at the colonel's left arm, made a decision, and with her teeth and her right hand working in terrible tandem, she wrapped the tourniquet above his elbow and cinched it tight. The metal bit into his skin. His eyes refocused on her face. "You saved me," he said. His voice was small, broken, the voice of someone who had just realized that another human being had chosen his life over the integrity of her own body. "I'm stopping the bleeding," she said. "Stay with me." "Oxygen saturation?" She didn't have an answer to her own question. The monitors were screaming data she couldn't reach, and her vision was starting to tunnel on the edges. Shock was winning. She could feel her body temperature dropping, could feel the specific weight of blood loss starting to affect her cognition. But the colonel's breathing had stabilized. His pupils were responsive. His hands were no longer trembling. Paramedics arrived 3 seconds after Dr. Mercer. They moved with the automatic efficiency of people who'd seen IED casualties before, clearing the room, loading stretchers, calling vitals out in the rapid-fire cadence of emergency medical response. Megan was on the stretcher before she realized it, someone cutting away her scrubs, someone starting and fall line with hands that moved like they'd done this 10,000 times. The colonel was beside her, his own stretcher being guided toward trauma surgery. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second before oxygen masks covered their faces and 2 different emergency procedures pulled them in different directions. The surgery took 4 hours. Or maybe 6? Time did strange things when you were bleeding from places that weren't supposed to bleed. She remembered the OR ceiling, remembered the anesthesiologist's name was Morrison, remembered the surgeon asking for a 14-gauge needle and something about closed cavity packing. She remembered deciding somewhere between the first hour and the second that if she was going to survive this, she needed to give herself permission to do it. The colonel was safe. The mission was compromised. Everything she built at Seattle General had just become irrelevant. What happened in the recovery room didn't happen. Or it did, and it belonged to someone else, a woman whose cover had been blown open as violently as the grenade that had torn through her shoulder. Because while Megan was still in surgical recovery, while her blood was still wet on the linoleum of room 412, Dr. Mercer picked up a phone and called the hospital administrator. His voice was smooth. Careful. The voice of a man who'd rehearsed this moment because he'd known it was coming, the way predators know when prey is about to become wounded enough to be interesting. The incident with Colonel Hartwick, he said. Captain O'Brien provoked an unstable patient. She created the dangerous situation through unauthorized interaction and personal involvement rather than following proper medical protocols. I have concerns about her judgment and whether she should continue practicing at Seattle General. The words were measured, professional, the kind of words that would slide through an investigation like water. The kind of words that made it sound like he was protecting the hospital instead of protecting himself, instead of making sure the one person who knew about his fraud was too busy fighting to save her own life to take another look at those Meridian Pharma invoices. By the time Megan woke up in the ICU with her left shoulder wrapped in white and her side stitched together with surgical precision, her badge had been deactivated. By the time the pain medication wore off enough for her to think in complete sentences, she'd been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By the time sunset was painting the Seattle General windows the color of old blood, she'd lost access to the one room in this hospital that mattered, the colonel's room, where he was alone, where visitors weren't being vetted properly, where a man with specific knowledge of classified operations was now vulnerable to exactly the kind of contact that 8 months of her life had been designed to prevent. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. from a number that didn't exist. One word, compromised. Then silence, then the phone going dark because certain phones weren't meant to stay lit very long. She was bleeding from places the surgery hadn't reached. The badge deactivated with a click that sounded like a coffin closing. For hours after the explosion, after the shrapnel was extracted and her shoulder was sutured closed with 42 stitches that pulled like barbed wire, the hospital administrator handed her the ID card and said the word she'd been dreading since the smoke cleared: administrative leave, pending investigation, access revoked to all restricted areas including the colonel's room. Mercer had already filed his report. Megan had provoked an unstable patient. Created a dangerous situation through unauthorized interaction. The administrator's voice was gentle but final, the way people sound when they're reading someone out of a life they thought was permanent. Mercer stood in the corner of that office, his face a mask of concern, his voice smooth as oil when he added, "I only want to protect the hospital and our patients from further incidents." The administrator nodded. Mercer looked at Megan with something that might have been sympathy if she didn't know it was victory. She'd spent 8 months building a classified protection mission, her real assignment, the reason she was there as a nurse instead of wearing dress blues, and Mercer had destroyed it in a single fabricated statement while she was bleeding out, stopping his victim from dying. The diner on Abercorn Street stayed open 24 hours. At 3 in the morning, Megan sat in a booth with cracked vinyl and a window that reflected her face back at her like a stranger's. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, cream separating into a film on the surface, bitter and useless. Her left shoulder throbbed beneath the bandages, a deep percussion of pain that kept time with her heartbeat, and she could feel the medication wearing off, the edges of sensation sharpening again, the reality of what had happened pressing down like a hand on her chest. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed with the sound of insects trapped in amber, relentless and mechanical. Rain hammered the parking lot outside, each drop sounding like applause for a performance no one wanted to see. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass, at the hollow-eyed woman who looked like she'd been dredged up from somewhere very deep and very cold. 30 days. That's all she'd needed. 30 more days of invisibility, 30 more days of keeping her head down while the colonel recovered and the federal security detail took over his case officially, and none of this would have happened. Now his protection was compromised because she couldn't keep her cover intact, couldn't stay small enough to be invisible, couldn't pretend to be just a nurse when a man she'd sworn to protect was screaming in terror and shrapnel was filling the air like metal rain. The coffee cup was cold against her palms. She wondered if the colonel was dead. She wondered if Mercer had already made sure of it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 5:30 in the morning, when her encrypted phone buzzed once, a message from a Pentagon number she knew by heart. Principal status? She didn't respond. Couldn't. If she reported that her principal was vulnerable, unguarded, separated from his protection detail and in a hospital where a corrupt doctor had access and motive, the entire operation would escalate into a classified panic that she'd triggered by failing to maintain her cover. If she didn't report it, she was abandoning him. The phone screen glowed in the darkness of the diner booth, waiting for an answer she couldn't give, and somewhere across the city in a secure federal hospital room, a decorated officer was probably wondering why the one person who understood what he was going through had suddenly vanished from his life. Seattle General's emergency bay doors burst open just after 6 that morning. The ambulance siren died to a whimper, and paramedics rolled in a stretcher under armed guard, federal protection detail, 3 agents in dark suits moving with the fluid precision of apex predators who'd spent their careers watching things that wanted to kill them. The patient on the stretcher was sedated but stable, a captured Taliban commander named Amir Khalik, admitted for emergency kidney surgery under a court order and federal custody arrangement that had been locked down so tight even the hospital's security team had been read in only 30 minutes before arrival. 2 federal marshals positioned themselves at the bay entrance. One took the elevator. One stayed by the door, hand on his SIG sour, eyes tracking every movement in the corridor like he was looking for ghosts that might be hiding in the antiseptic and fluorescent light. Megan was changing her bandages in the locker room when the hospital intercom crackled, urgent surgical consult, trauma bay 4, multiple staff. She wasn't supposed to be on shift. Her badge wouldn't let her through the restricted doors. But her hands were faster than her judgment, and before she thought about it she was moving through the hallway in scrubs that weren't hers, past a federal marshal who was looking at a tablet instead of at faces, and into the bay where surgeons were prepping for emergency nephrectomy and the patient on the table was starting to focus through the sedation, his dark eyes moving left, then right, then locking directly on the doorway where she stood. The scream that came out of him sounded like something tearing at its foundations. His body convulsed against the restraints, both wrists and ankles bound to the stretcher, and his voice became something primal and ancient, a Dari word, palang, palang, over and over again like a prayer or a curse. The Dari word for leopard. A name. Her name. The surgical team froze. One of the marshals drew his weapon, finger outside the trigger guard, scanning for threats. Khalik thrashed and screamed about Sanjan Valley, about Khalid's squad, about 12 men who walked into a kill zone in the summer of 2012 and only 3 walked out again. His eyes stayed locked on Megan's face, and in that moment she watched him understand that the woman he'd been hunting for 12 years, the woman his network had put a bounty on that never expired, the woman he'd killed an asset over trying to find, was standing 15 feet away in scrubs and a faded hospital ID, and she was watching him with the same calm that had been there in the mountains when she'd walked through his ambush like she owned the desert. That was the instant everything changed. Not the explosion. This. A Marine Corps liaison officer arrived within the hour, dressed blue so sharp they looked like they could cut, boots striking tile in a rhythm that meant business. His name was Major Thomas Clayton, and he carried a tablet computer that had been encrypted 3 ways before he even walked into the hospital. Behind him came 2 more officers in civilian clothes, NCIS, by the set of their shoulders and the way they moved like people accustomed to making other people nervous. Major Clayton walked straight past Dr. Mercer, who was still standing outside the surgical suite trying to understand what had just happened, and he found Megan in the hallway where a marshal had stationed her, separated from everyone else, hand on her arm but not rough about it. "Captain O'Brien." Not a question. A confirmation. She met his eyes and gave a single nod. He opened the tablet and began reading in a voice that carried through the corridor like a courtroom verdict, Bronze Star with Valor. The marshal's hand relaxed on her arm. Purple Heart. Around the corner, a nurse gasped. Combat medical badge. Dr. Mercer's face had gone the color of old milk. Additional commendation, Helm and Province, 2012, Distinguished Action Under Fire. Major Clayton kept reading, and with each line the hospital seemed to shrink around him, as if everyone was suddenly understanding that they'd been standing in a room with someone they couldn't see. The final words came quiet but absolute: active duty status, Special Operations Command, classified mission status, protected. Dr. Mercer's voice came from behind them, shaking like a man who'd just watched something foundational collapse. "I wasn't informed of this circus. This is a security breach. I demand to know why." "You demand?" The voice came from the elevator, and everyone in the corridor stopped breathing. A two-star general stepped out of that elevator like he owned it, like he owned the hospital, like he owned the air itself. His uniform was immaculate, his presence made the fluorescent light seem dimmer by comparison, and when he looked at Megan his eyes held something that might have been respect or might have been the kind of recognition that comes from understanding exactly what someone had already sacrificed. He rendered a crisp salute, fist to chest, eyes forward, the kind of salute you give to someone who outranks the uniform they're wearing. Megan returned it, and in that moment, standing in scrubs with bandages visible where she'd unbuttoned her collar to ease the pressure on her injured shoulder, every medal and commendation suddenly became visible on her skin, the scars that told the story of what she'd endured, what she'd survived, what she'd done when the world wasn't watching and there was nothing left to lose but the person next to her. The general turned to face Dr. Mercer. "Doctor, we need to discuss your supply chain practices. In detail. With the FBI. Right now." 72 hours later, forensic accountants were still counting the money. $1.2 million in kickbacks from Meridian Pharma over 18 months. Every orthopedic surgery on Mercer's schedule showing supply costs between 38 and 42% above market rate, approved by his signature, deposits hitting his personal bank account 48 hours after each procedure closed. The hospital administrator sat across from him with 3 lawyers present, laid out the spreadsheets like tarot cards predicting his future. Mercer tried to deflect, said it was Megan, said she'd been investigating him out of revenge, said she had a vendetta. The administrator cut him off mid-sentence. "She was a federal agent protecting a patient. You filed false reports against her. You restricted her access to her principal during a credible threat window. You fabricated disciplinary documentation." The state medical board opened proceedings the next day. His medical license was suspended immediately. 3 patients filed malpractice suits claiming unnecessary procedures, operations Mercer had recommended that generated maximum supply costs and minimum medical benefit. His wife hired a divorce attorney. The legal papers were delivered to him at the hospital in front of the same nurses who'd watched him humiliate Megan 6 months earlier, who'd left the break room when she sat down, who'd posted the formal write-up on the unit board like it was scripture. The nursing supervisor approached Megan in the hallway on Thursday morning. Her name was Patricia, and she'd worked at Seattle General for 19 years, and her hands were trembling when she spoke. "I'm sorry. He told us you were a problem. That you'd faked credentials. We should have questioned it. We should have." Megan nodded once, let her finish, didn't smile. "Mercy isn't the same as forgiveness." She walked away while Patricia was still apologizing, because some things break and you can't glue them back together, only learn to work around the cracks. That afternoon, before the federal security detail transferred Colonel Hartwick to a secure military medical facility 3 states away, he pressed something into Megan's hand. A patch. Faded, worn soft from 1,000 touches, the 7th Special Forces Group insignia barely visible on the rotting fabric. He'd carried it since Helmand Province, since 2012, and he pressed it into her hand with shaking fingers and no words necessary because there were no words adequate to what he was saying. She sewed it inside her jacket lining that night, next to her own, stitching with the precision of someone who'd learned field craft on stone and dust and blood, sewing a truth that had been hidden for 8 months but would never need to be hidden again. The world was watching now. But Megan O'Brien had been a hero long before they noticed. Subscribe to the Code Whisperers for more stories of hidden strength and unexpected valor. Like if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real story. Comment below, would you have walked away, or would you have thrown the punch?